what I've done in the way I've structured it is I'll just talk a little bit about QMASTOR, the start of that, why I ended up in entrepreneurship, and then I'll take you through some of the learnings really out of QMASTOR and Slingshot over the last, 20 years nearly. So when Siobhan asked me to talk about the journey, really officially I suppose the journey is 2001 to now, okay? So QMASTOR itself listed on the ASX in 2001 and I ran that for exactly 10 years and one day before we got acquired. And then pretty much almost straight away I started Slingshot. So Slingshot's now been running for 5 years. So I was a cutie back then. I looked at what's on the desk too. It's like old mouse pad, old 386 computer. The modem that's attached to that cost $11,000. It was a 9.6. Right, so internet speeds haven't really changed at all in Newcastle since then. This was a really interesting journey in that I didn't found QMASTOR. It was a piece of technology inside another business, and the business was at the time was a company called CCI, and they did logistics and coal testing laboratory services for the coal industry. And I ended up there somehow. I actually did environmental science at university, and somehow ended up working in the coal laboratory. But what they did have was a really, really awesome graduate program, right? So you had to learn the whole business from ground up, which suited me because I probably did have a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit and wanted to learn little bits about everything. So I think that's something that a lot of graduates don't get the opportunity to do today. You just get put in a box and that's where you got to fit. My managing director at the time was a really interesting cat. He probably pushed everything as close to the wind as he possibly could, right? And what he did with all of the graduates, I think there might have been about 8 that had gone through this program and graduated. He sat 8 in a row and went, "You're now the manager of Mirrabah Laboratory in Central Queensland, you're now and he just did that, right? And I got this little piece of shitty tech that had been built, right? And to be frank, he'd looked at, and it wasn't as arbitrary as that. We'd all obviously had been exposed to all these bits of things before. So I started as, I think, manager of a product called Pit to Port, which was a piece of software that basically tracked coal from a stockpile to the ship. So a coal stockpile up in the Hunter Valley to the ship here. And it was a pile of crap. Had been written by a contractor. It was terrible. So I came along and sold 3 of them, accidentally, really. I think that we were probably selling them for about $4,000 a year. So it was an annual subscription, about $4,000. And then pretty quickly, actually, I started to think this was actually a really interesting business. And I went back to the managing director and I said, I need some money to develop these products because they're rubbish, basically. And he said, well, it was another downturn in the coal industry, which happens every 3 years. And he said, well, we don't have any money. So he said, well, why don't we try and list it? Because CCI at the time was a listed company. So it seemed like an easy thing to do. And I said, yeah, sure, let's do that. So we, after about probably 2 years, the dot-com bubble started, right? And it actually made it much harder for us to get the listing away because they said, how much do you want? We said $3 million. That's what the whole company's worth. And they said, we'll give you 50. You just got it, but in Australia, unlike the US, you still had to make it sort of look like it was worth 50, right? And we couldn't make it anywhere near worth 50. So we tried to merge with some other some software companies that were sort of in the similar space, but a lot of those guys were just trying to exit their business at the time, and we were trying to start, and it never worked. And then the dot-com bubble burst, and we got the we got it away. And we grew it to a pretty, so we listed it, as said, in 2001 with 3 people and not much revenue. It took us actually 5 years to build it, right? So we did list with an idea, and it took us 5 years to really build the tech behind that to get that away. Where we ended up with offices in Perth, Newcastle, Wollongong and Mackay, but also offices in Brazil, South Africa, one in Quebec City in Canada and one in Denver in the US. So we built it to a pretty reasonable sized company. This is 110 employees, was turning over, when I left, about 16 million a year. But it had some inherent problems. Inherent problems was its market wasn't big enough, right? So we built a product that probably could only be sold to 2,000 customers globally. Now these bits of, pieces of software, when I left, were probably worth $1 million. So that same piece of software that we were selling for 3, we'd grown the value of that to be $1 million, but still it wasn't a massive market opportunity, okay? So when the company that acquired us in 2012 or 11 came along, it was probably a good opportunity to exit the business at that time and see what another global business could do with that. So once I exited that business, I spent some time in the US really looking at how I could have sped that 10-year journey up and made it 5, right? Like all CEOs are supposed to do is, go and sit on a mountain somewhere and contemplate how you could have done a better job. So I looked at, spent some time in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and had a look really around some of the things that were coming out of some of the universities, Harvard and Stanford at the time, and how they were approaching entrepreneurship. And what I found was that during the global financial crisis, a lot of the universities in the US, where they're just producing MBA graduates for, you'd be probably paying $250,000 to $500,000 for your Stanford MBA. They were just, those people were going straight to Ford, straight to McKinsey, straight to PwC, getting great jobs, right? So then the GFC came along and all those jobs dried up overnight. So what we do in the universities in Australia is we just keep producing graduates for jobs that don't exist, right? But what they did was, well, if your dad's or your mum or your whole family's paying that sort of money, you'd be better getting a job at the end of the day. So they looked to the only part of the economy that was doing well, which was the tech part of the economy, and tried to understand whether they could pivot from producing graduates to producing entrepreneurs and companies, okay? So a lot of the thinking around how to take a company from idea to scalable global business that we all sort of use today, and I use today in Slingshot, came out of that thinking around just post-GFC, okay? And one of the things that came out of that was this concept of an accelerator. So I'd come across probably the most famous accelerator, which is an accelerator called Y Combinator in the Valley. And they'd produced 2 companies that year. They produced Airbnb and Dropbox. So those companies had gone really from almost zero to being billion-dollar companies within 2 to 3 years, okay? And really being quite sizable companies within 6 months, okay? So the accelerator's concept is that usually an entrepreneur that's had a good exit gets together a whole bunch of other entrepreneurs. They create a fund. They all put money into that fund, and they invest in startups, usually a small amount of money, because we know now that you can build a business quite cheaply. You can rent server hosting, you can rent marketing, you can utilise a whole bunch of freeware and open source software to get stuff done. So they took that model, gave those entrepreneurs a small amount of money. Back then it was probably about $20,000, but they put them through a program. They just didn't give them money and say, see you later, best of luck. They put them through a 3-month intensive program where other mentors came and helped those businesses start and help them accelerate that growth, okay? And then at the end of that period, they brought in other investors to invest in those businesses and take those businesses forward. And that's the accelerator model that we see today. So in 2012, I brought that model back to Newcastle and sat down with a number of corporate partners that I'd given lots of money to when I was a listed entity, like my accountants, PwC, and my lawyers, Spark Helmore, and said, what do you guys think of this idea? And they said, excellent idea, think you should do it. And I didn't think it was a great idea because it didn't have a business model, right? So accelerators look fantastic. They get to invest in startups, but you can't eat equity, right? You can't, most of these startup founders won't get an exit for at least 5 years and most of them 10 years plus. So you can't eat equity. How do you actually live from that? Now, I had a bit of money behind me from the exit at QMASTOR, and I came across my other co-founder, which was Craig Lambert. He was headhunted by Nathan Tinkler to come back to Newcastle from the UK and be the head of sales and marketing for the Knights and the Jets. It's fair to say that didn't go very well. And I met Craig at a golf day and sort of understood that something interesting about him. He was one of the founders of Yahoo in Australia. So I thought, here's a guy with a lot of sales and marketing expertise. I've got a good ops background, an investment background. Maybe we can work on this project together. And to be frank, without Craig and myself being able to work as a team on that project, it never would have happened. So we kicked the program off in 2012. We ran it out of Spark Helmore, just across the road. We got 8 awesome founders. Half of the founding teams came from Sydney up to Newcastle to participate, and we ran them through the program. And I think probably 1 or 2 of those startups got funded post-program, but really I think 4 of them should have, okay? And the reason they didn't was that I couldn't get them into customers quickly enough, right? So I couldn't take those startup founders and get enough customer traction into them to get investors interested in them. So at the same time, because we didn't have a business model, we were doing a lot of consulting work for PwC and a whole bunch of other people, trying to teach corporates how to think like startups, which doesn't work. And I'll come to that in a second. But NRMA came to us and said, oh, you guys are doing some awesome stuff around an accelerator or something, don't know what it is, but can you come and teach us how to think like a startup? And we said, no, it doesn't work. And they were like, well, you're the first person to tell us that we can't teach us to think like startups. But what we said is that, you know what you've got? You've got 2 million customers that are exactly the same. And I've got all these awesome startups that need one thing, customers, right? You guys have no idea how to start. The only thing the startups know how to do is start, right? So if you can bring those 2 forces together, that could be an awesome win-win. And that's the genesis of the Corporate Accelerator that Slingshot runs today. And we've sort of validated that we've validated that hypothesis that you can bring those 2 forces together, that one having skills in starting, one having skills in scaling is a good fit. It doesn't always work, but it works pretty well. So what we do is we talk to the corporate about what is strategically important in their future business, and then in a way we crowdsource startups to those themes to work with a corporate. And those corporates are interested in a couple of things, generally 1 or 3 things. Just simply using that startup's technology internally, right, which we often forget about as a vendor. Secondly, distributing that awesome product to their existing customer base. And thirdly, investing or acquiring that startup, okay? And that's the nub of the whole model that Slingshot runs today. So I'm going to take you through a few learnings. So the first one is that startups with 1 word. There's no hyphen in there, right? It's really important. It's a thing. It's now a thing. So I'm often trying to teach I think newspapers are starting to get to it, but yeah, startups 1 word. So the other thing about startups is I think they're the closest thing to old school rock bands, right? So generally they start in garages. They're not very good at the start, generally bloody hopeless. They're only driven by emotion and passion. They don't have skills. They're rough, unpolished and raw. Good thing is they've got nowhere to answer to, so they feel like they're, this is really interesting, right? Startups have a lot of hardcore fans, right? So if you probably think of the early adopters around the technologies that you use today, like an Airbnb or an Uber or whatever, generally those early adopters are their hardcore little teeny fans, right? Same as a band. And importantly, a hell of a lot of them fail, right, and go nowhere. On the other hand, corporates are like the old school rock labels, right? So they've got lots of distribution, great marketing, lots of channels, but they're full of suits who are not great at playing music, even though they want to, right? So a lot of corporates that we work with, we think they're great innovators, and they're not, right? So once again, bringing those two forces together work. Okay, so stuff I've learnt the hard way. It's not all been hard, to be frank. This is something that I think is really true. It's Sean Parker's quote from The Social Network, right? Which is, running a startup's like eating glass. You just like to taste the taste of your own blood. And that is so true of even what I've done through that last sort of 15-year journey and what our startup founders do on a weekly basis. So I thought I'd start at the start. So if I thought about how I've sort of got to this point, so the first thing was that people ask me a lot, should I go to university or should I drop out straight away? And I'm a big fan of actually people going through university. I think it adds a lot of value. I don't think doing a lot of postgrad stuff adds a lot of value, but I definitely think undergrad's really important. So that's the first thing. But if that's your day job, what's your night job? And I talk to entrepreneurs a lot about this. A lot of them say, well, I'm working in a corporate or I'm at university, I can't do that because I don't have time. Well, my question is, what's your night job? Most people can have a night job. And my night job was this company here, Cardiff Pizza Express, that started with 3 other university mates while I was at university in about 1992. I still fit the shirt, which is good. And the good thing was that we were like a little rock band, right? We had in fact, we had like the arrogant guy, the guy that got drunk all the time, the guy that didn't show up, the guy that was trying real hard, all of that. So we had that sort of mix. Had a couple of drop out of the band as we went through, and we ended up with 2 at the end. But yeah, shoot. Yeah, good question actually. I'm generally always in the middle. I'm probably the boring one, trying to keep it a bit together. Do you know what I mean? I'm probably not that anymore, but I was back then. Right? I was a little bit, I was trying hard. The important thing as well was that pizza shops are great because somebody's going to make the dough about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You don't have to open till 5 and you run it to 2 a.m. So in terms of fitting in with university, it worked really well. So it was an awesome opportunity. We didn't have any money, so we just rented everything. We rented the ovens, we even rented the pizza trays, right? We had a rough idea of what the base recipe was, and then everything else we just guessed, okay? And it actually turned into a pretty awesome little business. And once again, if I knew what I knew then, it would have been, we probably had back then something very franchisable on our hands, okay? But I think the good thing was, it's a bit like a startup, just do it. Right? So I didn't think about, and then I looked at afterwards. I never registered the business, or never had it as a factory. So I don't even know how I sold it. I sold it. Well, the 2 of us at the end sold it. The other 2 had disappeared by then. But I learned a hell of a lot about business just from doing it. Really, everything was cash. We were just paying people in envelopes, and I ended up with a massive tax bill at the end. So it was good. But it worked. So then I got the money that I'd used or generated out of the pizza shop. I used to go overseas. All the best entrepreneurs I know are well travelled, right? Because if you're thinking about talking to customers, your ability to interact with different cultures and different customers, meet new people, negotiate sales, working from the bottom up, I think travel gives you a really good opportunity to do that. So I worked in a bar for a year in the UK and ran around and just, spent a lot of time in Asia and everywhere else. So most of the people that I would count as awesome entrepreneurs and really good in business are also well travelled. And I don't know which way it goes, just have they been successful in business, therefore they've got money to travel? I don't think that's the case because most of them were travelling in their early 20s, right? And I just had a really good set of parents that just chucked me on a plane and said, see you in 2 years, which doesn't happen as much as it probably should. Okay. Sorry? Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I'm chucking them on a plane, get rid of them. It's cheaper, I reckon, that way. So the other thing I learned really, really early is resilience, and this is almost an unfair advantage, right, that entrepreneurs have. So unfair advantage, if you think about your lean canvas, is something that's not easily copied or bought, and I think actually resilience is something that's not easily copied or bought. So your ability to chew glass and like the taste of your own blood is critical to entrepreneurship. So this is the table of contents for my IPO prospectus. All right. Can anybody see something interesting in that first paragraph? There's points if you get it. It's the first sentence.
Not long after.
2 days after September 11. Right? So here's me with my new business, about to put it out for investors to invest in, and some clown just decided to fly some planes into the World Trade Center. So nearly every other prospectus that was in the market at that time got withdrawn, right? Because what happens is that you get an underwriter to underwrite the float, which basically means that they will fill in the gap or the shortfall if you don't, so that the float gets away. But if the market changes by more than X%, they're out, right? So here we were with a lot of money invested in it. We had no choice but to proceed with it. But what it meant was that we had to get a cornerstone investor to come in at the last minute to take something like 30% of the company to get the float away. That investor had no idea what he was investing in. He was actually an international investor and he thought we were a coal company, right? So it then took me another 7 years to fix that problem because I had investors on my share register that really didn't want to be involved in the business, okay? So resilience is something, the ability to bounce back from this sort of stuff over and over and over again is really important. And I see a lot of startup founders, the ones that succeed really well are the ones that just can get kicked and kicked and kicked and keep getting up. This other thing, this is a tough one for family and friends that are involved with startup founders, that once you're on the startup roller coaster, you actually can't get off it. And what I mean by that is, if it gets large enough, you're going through these ups and downs, but you've got people that work for you, you've got families involved, so you've got to keep pushing on the up. The only way you can get out of it is to close it or sell it, and that's it. They're the only two options. So you can't just sit there and let it meander. And that's why a lot of businesses, particularly Newcastle-based businesses, just happy to keep a lifestyle business that just generates enough money to employ themselves, maybe go pay for their surfing holiday every 12 months, but don't really want to ever employ more than 2 to 3 people. Okay, and that's a big issue, I think, for the Australian economy. There's not enough people that want to really grow large global businesses that employ lots of people. But that's another truism. This is something that first managing director told me. In fact, I used to look at the door into my office at the time when people had offices. I looked from my desk straight into the door, and above that door I wrote the letter L, because most founders and most startup founders just want to sell all the time, right? So they want to tell people, particularly if you've got a direct sort of personality, generally you're telling people and you're not listening, right? So the biggest tip I got, and I always try and remember to do it, and I always recommend to my startup founders, is that listening is really, really important, particularly when you're growing a business. Obviously, trying to be customer-centric is important, but trying just to sit in a meeting and maybe speak for less than 30% of the time, which is probably the ideal target, is very, very difficult. So everybody's trying to sell all the time. You're trying to say how good your business is, how good your product is, and why you should do X or Y. I think the real secret is to listen. Okay, this one I only learnt recently because I never thought about it in this perspective. So the other thing as a startup founder, you've got to be very passionate about what you're doing, okay? But you don't want to be so passionate that you ignore the truth, because founders are really good at falling in love with their solution. okay? So I think this is a really good way of expressing it. So you do want somebody that has a very strong opinion about their customer, their business, everything, I think, in this space. But if you get proven wrong, you've got to be able to change, right? Because if you don't, you do one of two things. You work on a stupid idea for 2 years, you invest your mortgage, you waste your life, all those sorts of things, right? So I come from a science background, and I think this sort of new way of looking at things with doing experiments, doing validation, A/B testing, everything, means that, okay, if the results are telling me that I'm wrong, right? I can pretend that I'm right. You know, I can say the customer's wrong, but they're not wrong, right? I've got plenty of startups that have invested more than $1 million that come to me, maybe $1 million, at least $500,000 into product, and have got 6 customers a month, turning over $500. And their opinion is that the customers want it. Well, they don't want it, right? So you've got to have a strong opinion. You don't want to be wishy-washy, but you've got to be able to drop it. This is another thing I learned. So I always just thought if I could just employ 5 more people like me, life would be so much easier because they would know exactly what I want to do. And I did do that. I employed quite a few people. I employed a couple of people that actually looked like me as well, right? But I think diversity is really important. So not only male-female diversity, but I think you do want the 3 crazy people in your office as well. You obviously want as much cultural difference in there as well, because if you think about who your customers are, they're male, female, they're slightly eccentric people, you know, across a wide range of races. So big thing is early, particularly early, you just want to employ mini-me's because it does, in a way, it does make your life easier, but I don't think your business grows as fast if you do that, okay? And the other thing is if you employ mini-me's, you can never really delegate yourself out of it because you're sort of in love with the people you've got and you can never step away. So my big thing, which I learned early, is stop doing that. And I think myself and Craig being very, very different, you know, he's the art, I'm the science in our relationship, works really, really well, okay? We're 100% different people, and that's the secret of our success, I think. Okay, so this is a good little example. So this is something that startups never do, even though they're told to do it, because they're in love with the product, which is sell it first before you build it, okay? So get some sort of currency for your product first before you do anything, and that currency could be dollars, but it could be business cards, email addresses, something personal that a customer's going to give you that says to you there's a market. If somebody says to you, I wouldn't buy it, but I'm sure there's a lot of people that would, nobody's going to buy it, right? So how do you get currency out of a customer before you actually build it? So this is a good example. So this little piece of, this is a report, and what it does is when these big coal ships arrive in the port, they're actually only there for a short window of time, and if they're there for a longer window of time, the coal producers putting coal on that ship has to pay for that ship to be there. And there's a very complex calculation about what's included in that time. You know, like if there's a rain delay, that might not be included. Like a mechanical breakdown might not be included. So calculating all of this stuff is very difficult. So this thing here, you can actually see there, this is the marriage cost, was it 55 million bucks? They're big numbers, right? So I had to do a sales presentation to a large multinational mining company who were interested in buying our product. I knew they were particularly interested in this piece of functionality. Can anybody, you probably don't know, that's 100% photoshopped, right, that report. And I built a few forms that generate that photoshopped hardwired report, and 10 minutes before I did the presentation, that's what it looked like. Okay? So, and so I was sweating bullets, right? And very quickly we fixed it because I had a good startup team and we were all focused on getting this deal done. That deal's worth $2 million bucks, all right? So I changed that and I got it back to that. I did the demonstration and sold it for $2 million bucks. Now, that did present a problem, which is now I've got to build it, okay? but I knew I could build it if I got the $2 million, right, which is important. Now, if you don't know whether you can build it or not, then I think it's still okay to sell it first, but you've got to give the money back or not take the money in the first place, okay? So, I think Possible and Kickstarter in terms of crowdfunding is exactly that when you think about it, right? Which is, if I can't raise the money, I'll give the money back, but I'm reasonably confident I can build it. And now, obviously, people that do a lot of Kickstarters aren't that confident because they can never deliver it, but you should be at least confident. So the ultimate test is getting currency out of customers before you build it. And I fall into that trap. I fall into this trap a lot, and I've got to go back and test it, okay? And I'll give you two quick little examples that I actually talked to the staff, 4,000 students, about yesterday. So the first one was, last year we thought that we could sell education to startup entrepreneurs to make it reasonably cheap, but bringing all the learnings that we had in the accelerator and teach other founders who don't get in the accelerator exactly what we do, okay? But we want to get paid for it because we weren't going to do it for free. And I can't remember what the number was, but let's say it was $2,000 a course. So a lot of people have very strong opinions as to whether that was going to work or not going to work within our organisation. So what we did was we threw up a smoke test, we created a page on our website, we did some social media advertising and used our direct EDM, our emails to our database, and threw maybe, $2,000 at the whole thing, right? And guess what? Nobody signed up, right? The reason is because you can't sell stuff to startups, which we knew to start with, but it was a good test, right? Startups got no money, how are they going to pay for stuff, right? The other one was we've recently built a product called Co-Ventured. And what Co-Ventured is an online marketplace. It's basically like LinkedIn for corporates and startups, right? So when we work with corporates, those corporates pay us a lot of money to run a program. What if you're a corporate that's only just coming into the market and maybe hasn't got a mature innovation strategy, but just wants to start to understand startups and where would you find them, etc. And on the other hand, we might have 2,000 startups apply for our programs a year and only take 30. What do you do with the other 1,970? So here's two sides of the market. So let's test whether we could build a piece of software to bring those two parties together. Now that was going to be a super expensive piece of software, right? Let's pick a number, 300 grand, right? Just for the MVP. So what we decided to do was test it. So once again, we threw up a smoke test and we did an experiment to say if we could sell 20 licenses to corporates, I won't tell you what the money is, but it's not a huge amount of money, but it's a good size money. If we could sell 20 of those licenses within 3 months, we'd build it. So what we did was we set a minimum expectation of 20 and we time boxed it within 3 months, right? So you can't do another experiment which says, well, if we can sell 20, I'll do it. Oh, we only got 15, it took 2 years, so we still did it. No, we said, we're going to do that many in this time box. And we did it. We actually sold more than that, okay? So we've now built it. And we used all the money from the pre-sales to actually build it. So it's really cost us nothing out of our own pocket, and we validated there's a real business, and that business is going really, really well. Okay, so there's two good examples. So even in large-scale pieces of software, even hardware, I think the same applies. So sell it first. Yeah, and that's the other good thing was this Microsoft early. Like, how's that for an error? Object reference not set to an instance of an object. I read that so many times at QMASTOR, it drove me nuts. Okay, the other thing is that founders should always own the product. And what I mean by that is own it all the way to the end of the company. So you start by owning the product, obviously, you're a founder, but then you're bringing on other people, product people, R&D people, CEOs, other C-level people. You should never let go of product. It's the last thing to let go. Okay, so bring in all these other people to run your business for you, but never let go of the product direction. Okay, these guys never let go of the product direction. The only thing Steve Jobs was doing at the end was product. That's it. Wasn't running the company, wasn't managing people. He was just doing product only. And you can see from Elon's perspective, he owns the product, right? So, and if you actually see, when they're doing new product releases, he's in a sleeping bag under his desk getting this stuff done, right? And I'm sure he's doing the stuff with SpaceX as well. You know, every time a rocket takes off, I reckon he's the night before really thinking about it. In terms of the product direction, these guys own the product. Really important. This is the other thing. So a lot of founders, if we come back to that listening problem, want to sell all the time, but there's a lot of dickheads in the space as well, both male and female, to be frank. And most people want to invest and work with people that are likable, right? And maybe in the US, investors will invest in people that are not likable, but I think the Uber CEO's experience recently is that it would be better if you're likable to start with, right? So particularly when you've got a small market, so you know, somewhere like Newcastle or Hunter, everybody knows everybody, right? So it's very hard to burn a bridge in a Hunter. The same goes in Sydney, to be frank. So if you can be likable, you'll find that people will do stuff for you, okay? This is the last one. So going back to actually Carolyn's in there, I think. There's Carolyn. This is the last one. So if I go back to that chewing glass thing and the roller coaster, what I found for probably 12, 13 years was that I just thought about tomorrow every day, right? It's all I ever thought of. And I'd be sitting there daydreaming about tomorrow always, and always forget about the now, the today, because everything does happen in the now, obviously, right? But I only ever thought about tomorrow for all that time, right? So, and I'd probably spent, I reckon, nearly a month a year for 10 years in another country. And I'd seen parts of those countries, but I was more worried about, well, where have I got to be tomorrow, right? I wasn't even enjoying things. Like, I think I've been to Weipa. I'm a bit of a fishing fan. I've been to Weipa in far north Queensland at least 10 times, never been fishing once when I was there, because I was worried about flying out tomorrow and doing other things. So in that 10, 15 years goes real quick. So the awesome people that you meet, so your friendships really in startups are sort of tempered by the fire. So, you know, if you get an opportunity to work in businesses, a lot of those friendships last forever, but often you don't enjoy them enough because you're always thinking about tomorrow. So that's me in a nutshell. Questions? Simple, isn't it?
How did you go about, did you find this a buyer for QMASTOR, or did they come to you?
They came to me, so it was an aggressive takeover, which was fun, right? So good way to find people to acquire you is, yep, you can reach out to them or use advisors or whatever. The best way is to beat them to a job, right? So we won a large job in the US. They were a US company. They're like, here's these guys, right? And then they looked at our customer base, and we had pretty much every global mining customer. You know, we scheduled all the ships and trains in and out of the port of Newcastle and, you know, offices around the world, and they went, wow, actually this is a pretty impressive bunch of guys, but they're still Australians, so we'll just lowball them a cheap offer, right? And the investors that we had, and this is another thing for startups, if you've got investors or stakeholders, we kept them informed all the time. We were writing updates, they knew exactly where we were, they knew the vision of the company, and that proved great because when the offer came, they all rejected it. Every single one of them rejected it, right? And they ended up paying double what their original offer was, right? So it does get to a point where it is in the interests of the shareholders to sell when it's double the value, you know. I think it was still cheap, but as you sort of see it's still in the commodity industry has been difficult since I've sold it. So timing was probably pretty good. So that's one good way. Generally, the other important thing is a lot of angel investors and high net worth investors are always asking for what the exit strategy is. Generally, I'm more interested in about what that startup's trying to do to change the world or their customers. So I'm not overly interested in exit. It's good. All you need to do though is just to make sure when you set your company up on day one, that's an investable company, right? So it's not structured in a way that nobody can invest in it. So beware of backyard accountants structuring companies, because I see a lot of those and I've got to completely restructure them. We would nearly reincorporate every company that comes into Slingshot because they're uninvestable. So that's a tip.
Another question. Currently I'm involved with 10 creatives out of space out at Clyde Road, where Savington's places are.
Sure.
Anyway, they've got 10 creatives in this one giant space, and I'll be out there making content, producing some content.
Yep.
I've got the idea that perhaps we could produce a TV pilot,
Mm-hmm.
you know, along the lines of iFish,
Yep.
and then sell it to a network.
Mm-hmm.
Then, as we're talking, we're thinking of just putting it up on Facebook, you know,
Yep.
as a hobby.
Sure.
But why should we do it as a hobby? Why can't we do it as a startup?
We can, but putting it up on Facebook and YouTube's the ultimate test, though, as to whether you should sit down and be serious about it, right? So if you think about, you know, the highest rating television show at the moment is on YouTube. It's not on, you know, it's not on screen. So if you can do you know, make some awesome content, get it up on YouTube and see how it goes. Maybe chuck a bit of marketing at it as a test. Then that's a real good way of doing something before you get into, you know, to scale. So you can do both. That's the beauty of it. And to be frank, I'd be making stuff for YouTube now instead. I think you've got a better market. You know, you're going to make iFish for Channel 10, or you're going to make, you know, your own brand that's global. You know, so the other good thing is, you know, a niche in Newcastle's tiny. The same niche globally is massive, right? So if you can find an awesome niche, you know, like cat videos.
Call it I Create, because they're a creative.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
Each week, you get someone else in,
Mm-hmm.
guest appearances, things like that.
Yeah. We can test it, see whether people want to watch it or not.
Test it, so we'll test it on YouTube.
It's a good test.
And what advice would you give to people who have got an idea but they don't have a specific skill set to make it happen? So, for instance, if someone has the tech skills but not the marketing or business acumen and vice versa?
Yep. So I did science. I didn't know how to write a line of code. So obviously you've got to bring a team to the table. One thing I have noticed though is if you can't bring a team, if you can't sell your idea to other founders, you can't sell it to customers, right? So unless you can bring people to you, your business is not going to succeed anyway, okay? So see a lot of founders going, oh, I need to find a tech founder because they've got this awesome business. Well, they don't, right? And if they were passionate about it, they would be at the meetups, they would be coming to these events, they'd be in the co-working spaces, they'd be travelling to Sydney, they'd be doing everything trying to find that person, right? And they're there. There's lots of them. You know, I see them all the time. In fact, I think I've got 3 CTOs at the moment that don't have a job that are looking to work with startups, which is unusual. Usually you can't find them, but they're there. If I know 3, there must be 300 of them. You know, so it's getting out and networking and building your network up. And that's something I've also learned probably from Slingshot from QMASTOR Slingshot. QMASTOR, I had my head down just building, right? Nobody in Newcastle knew who the hell QMASTOR was. I think 80% of our revenue by then was international. So, you know, I just had head down. Now, since I've got my head out of the business more and building that network, I can bring all these other people. So if you look at the Slingshot business at the moment, there's probably 20 people involved in it. And all of them we've met through network only. Haven't recruited anybody in a traditional sense. So it's not easy. It's not easy to find good co-founders, but they're there.
Where do you see Slingshot in 10 years?
Oh God, thanks, Mum. It's interesting. So I'm product guy. So you can see products. Slingshot's heavy services when you think about it, right? So things like co-ventured to me really excite me because it makes what we're doing from a services perspective much more scalable. Definitely it'll be global by then. It should be global by next year, really. We just did our first roadshow in New Zealand. So it's the first time we've taken Slingshot out of Australia. Good opportunities in Asia. I actually think we can take a bit of coal back to Newcastle and take this model back into the US too. And it's just at the moment just making sure that before we overscale, we just want to make sure we've got what we're doing now down pat and getting the right people to come underneath us so we can get back to international expansion. So, but do you know what I mean? I have no exit strategies. I'm really enjoying it actually.
What do you see as sort of the top benefits of working in a regional city like Newcastle as opposed to Sydney, Melbourne, or even somewhere global?
Yeah. So if you think about I still think if you think about the best sort of tech hubs in particular globally, they're in the second largest city in the state. San Francisco, Boulder, Austin, Manchester, etc., etc. So, and the reason is because there's less noise, right? So, can I ring Mark Fitzgibbon tomorrow? Probably. You know, I'll probably get through. You know, or any of the bank CEOs, Scott Morgan, or those guys. Yep. Can I ring Michael Nielsen at Hunter Medical Research Institute? Yep. Can I do that in Sydney? No chance. I wouldn't get. There'd be 3 PAs and EAs that I'd have to get through to even get there. So, the other thing is that. So that's one. So not a lot of noise, and you can get directly to somebody. There's a lot of you have to collaborate when you're in a small region because there's not enough people to compete against, right? So in Sydney, oh man, there's some sex. There's like sex inside of startup land. So there's all these little fiefdoms and egos and all that sort of stuff. Even little sub-regional ones and by suburb there. That doesn't happen in a regional setting. So I think they're the main benefits. You know, you can grow, and you can grow a business out of here and make it global. There's plenty of examples of good global businesses come out of Newcastle. We probably don't celebrate them enough, but there's lots of examples. And I think the days are probably gone where if you're a startup, you need to, on day one, move to Silicon Valley. I think those days are gone. If your customers are there and you think the bulk of your investment there, you might start here and maybe end up there, or at least have an office over there, like Atlassian probably is a good example. But there's no reason we can't start here anymore.
What's the most successful venture you've had so far in Slingshot?
That's a good question. So I would say, I don't want to pick on anybody, but probably gamers at the moment. They're up to about 3 million monthly active users. Campify is definitely the best Newcastle-based one. I think the one cohort, so we've now generated $255 million worth of companies, of which 95 million of that was from zero, from PowerPoint deck, right? So if you think in that time, it's probably 30 startups in that, maybe a bit under that, in that $90 million of bracket from companies that came in with a PowerPoint deck. So that's impressive as well. So they didn't come in worth $100 million and we turned them into $102 million. They came in with zero. So that's been the exciting thing. And the other thing is we've probably got about 140 or 150 founders in our alumni now, and that's awesome. So somebody that joins the Slingshot program now is already in this big family of mentors and alumni. So we've generated some good ones. Probably got just of startups, maybe 14 really, really good ones, and in scale-ups, probably another 20 out of that. So we've probably done 52, 35 of them are pretty fantastic companies.
We might have to wrap up
Good.
there just because it's getting
Yep.
close to the hour and some people might need to get
Sure.
to work. So thanks so much, Trent.
No problems.
for all your
Thanks for coming, everyone.